you that no one else on the call might know. I'll begin, set it off. I'm Brahmatirtha. I'm the director of the Bhaktivedanta Institute for Higher Studies. And I'm here because I was invited to talk about science and spirituality. And what you might not know about me is I used to be a pilot, which proves there's God because I don't see very well and I couldn't fly, which proves there's God because I'm still alive and I'm speaking to you. So we got past that. So each of you, go on. Daniel, you direct who should go next, please.
I guess I'll go next and then I'll popcorn to whoever's next. So my name is Damodar Smarta Das. I'm originally from California. I'm now here in Chicago. I'm here because science was always my favorite subject in school. And that was one of the few ones that I was always consistently good at and got good grades in. And something that people might not know about me is I am just now, from this whole quarantine, starting to get pretty decent at cooking now. But prior, I wasn't considered so much, but pretty excited about that.
One of the silver linings. Okay, Damodar, send it on to someone else, please.
Yamuna, Jivan Prabhu.
Yeah, so my name is Yamuna Jivan Das, and let's see, something that you don't know about me. I actually grew up in Nigeria. Probably you don't know that, in Africa, and
that makes sense.
Lived in Europe for some time, but I'm Indian of ethnicity.
You grew up in Nigeria. That means you're not one of these people that calls up and says you got to send money. No.
Oh, well, I know them. They're my neighbors. They were my neighbors and relatives and stuff. So.
Okay. Actually, Nigeria has the smartest people in Africa, but there are some really sharp people. Bhaktivedanta Swami used to minister there, would tell me how sharp they are, but at the same time, it sort of has a lot of cheaters. It's an unusual place. Okay, next. Who's next? Damodar? We can probably only go with the first 10, so we'll have time for it.
You're on mute, Damodar. You're still on mute.
You're still on mute, Damodar. I usually say my most profound comments when I'm on mute, but go for it.
I said something very profound. You guys totally missed it. For sure. You guys will always have to wonder what it was. Pracarananda Prabhu, would you like to go next?
You're on mute, Pracarananda, and that was very profound.
I never say anything terribly profound. I'm Pracarananda Das. I am the managing director of the Bhaktivedanta Institute for Higher Studies in Gainesville, Florida, although until about a month ago, I'd been living in Canada, where I was the director of geothermal energy research at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, which is a fairly large research program. And one thing that nobody knows about me except for two of you on this call is I recently quit that job to go teach math and science at the Alachua Gurukul.
And he's also has a PhD in geology. Okay, Damodar, who's next? We'll do a few more as we're waiting for more to come.
I see Navina Nirada Prabhu on the call. Would you like to go next?
A dear friend of mine.
Hare Krishna. Well, I'm happy to be here with all of you by invitation. So anyway, my dad was a science teacher. My uncle was a science teacher. I dropped out of 9th grade and joined the Sankirtan Army. And I've been doing almost 40 years of full contact, as they call it. And now I still went back to playing ice hockey. That's something that you might not have known. And then retired from combat. So now here in a cabin in Carmel Valley in California, trying to get into writing. So yeah, excited to hear some of your insights.
Wait a second.
Hare Krishna.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
I see. Should we do one more, or are you ready to get started?
More people are joining, so let's do a few more before we begin. It's just, we can go on in a few more minutes. Let's do another several.
Sure. I see on video, I see Atavi Krishna Das Prabhu. Hare Krishna, welcome.
Hare Krishna, thank you so much. Please accept my humble obeisances. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Thank you for this. I'm actually from Mexico, Guadalajara, Mexico. I'm a disciple of Srila Virabahu. And when I met the devotees in early years, one of the first books I read was Perfect Questions, Perfect Answers.
Me
that's
too.
How I got to,
Yeah.
So that's how I got to know about the story of Brahmatirtha Prabhu, and it was a wonderful book. I've read it many times, and up till now, nearly 15 years later, I'm still book distributor, and that's one of the books I distribute currently to the people in the streets. So I'm very honored to be in your association, Prabhu, and all the Vaishnavas.
And I'm glad to have you here, and of course, Vira Prabhu is an old, wonderful friend.
All right, let's see who we have next. I see more people joining on the call. Welcome, 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 everybody. I see, I can't tell if that's Nityananda Pran Prabhu?
It is.
Is that?
That is.
Jai, Nityananda Pran Prabhu.
And the three things, people say your name, why you're here, and something about you that other people on the call probably don't know.
So I'm Nityananda Prandas. I have Hemangi also here. I live and serve in Chicago. Brahmatirtha Prabhu and I have worked together on the worst topics that we never want to touch again.
He's right on that. Yeah.
Now, besides that, I have great respect for Brahmatirtha Prabhu, and jokes aside, I've learned to see and work and get a benefit from his funny side, but very sharp intelligence, and the way he brings Krishna consciousness down to very relational aspects of dealings with each other. So which I appreciate a lot more personally, and so I'm very, very excited that you agreed to come and do this Truth Matters tonight.
And I'll say that I'm also co-director of ISKCON Resolve, the conflict resolution arm of ISKCON. And when some rough issues have come up, that I had to work with Nityananda Pran, not a conflict with him, but other conflicts. And he and I have worked together several times, and he's a special gentleman in my mind. So you're very fortunate to have him in Chicago. Okay, let me see, we have 19 on. Let's do, Damodar, let's do 2 more introductions.
I see Sparsh Gautam. Hare Krishna, good to see you.
Hare Krishna.
It's gotten long. Would you like to say something, say your name, what brought you here tonight, and something that we might not know about you already?
Sure, yeah, of course. Hare Krishna, my name is Sparsh Gautam. I came to this talk, well, I'm very new to the monthly series, so I was very curious and the topic kind of got me interested, the science and spirituality. So that, yeah, it seemed very interesting. Something that many people don't know about me is I live in Botswana, so another member. Yeah.
Another one.
Yeah. Together with Yamuna Prabhu.
What time is it in Botswana right now?
Well, right now, currently I'm in Chicago.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, like I spent most of nearly all my childhood and my high school years in Botswana, yeah.
Boy, Botswana is a beautiful, beautiful place.
Have you ever been?
I've seen pictures and many pictures.
Yeah, and I mean, very much known for its natural scenic beauty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, Damodar Smaran, Hemangi wanted to say Hari Bol to Brahmatirtha Prabhu.
Hare
I'm sorry, say
Krishna.
it again.
Prabhu.
Hare
Hari
Krishna.
Bol.
This is Hemangi Dasi from Chicago.
Oh, yes.
Prabhu, I don't know if you remember, but in 2002, yourself, myself, Yogeshwar Prabhu, and Rajavihari Prabhu, we all were part of the first conflict resolution training.
Oh, now I'm putting two and two together. I saw your name, but I didn't put two. Yes, in Tawako, New Jersey.
Yes, Tawako, New Jersey with Kaulini Mataji, Rajalila Prabhu.
Yeah.
It was a very memorable weekend with Mother Krishna Leela. And it is so nice to again see you after all these years. And also all the behind the scenes things. So thank you very much.
Oh, this is fascinating. What a nice connection. Okay, and we have one more, Damodar.
Yes, I see on here Acharya Nishta Prabhu. Hare Krishna, welcome.
Hare Krishna.
Would you like to say what brought you here tonight and something that we might not know about you already?
Well, I first met Brahmatirtha Prabhu in Gainesville. I was a student at the Christian House there, 2010 or 11. And I was so inspired also that I believe, Prabhu, you ran for mayor or governor? Or
no, but I was involved in local politics. Yeah.
Okay, involved in politics. So
yeah.
Had such a good experience there. Something you might not know about me. I grew up in Indonesia, and my dad purchased a Hanuman sculpture, which we had in our front yard growing up. So despite not knowing anything about Vedic culture, we always revered Hanuman. Perhaps some of that Sukriti is cashing in now.
And what was your name in Krishna House?
Aiden, Bhakta Aiden.
Okay, now I'm putting two and two together. And why were you in Indonesia?
Oh, my dad was working overseas there. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Damodar, if somebody else feels they really like to introduce themselves, they can.
Well,
otherwise, we'll begin.
I'll introduce myself. Hi there. I'm Justin. I came to this mini seminar, namely because I would like to have, I've been searching for, trying to figure out if there's any spiritual truth in the world, and I would like to look at it through a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach. I did go to the temple in Chicago a few times and did some kirtan there, and I have read some of Prabhupada's works. And one thing that I don't really have anything else to say, but yeah, it's nice to meet you all.
We're happy you're here, Justin. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Thanks for coming. Now, just a few order of business. We ask everyone who's not speaking to generally keep muted, and then I ask everyone who doesn't mind to turn on their video. Now, for some people, it may not be practical, but when Pracarananda and I are speaking, we'll be giving this jointly. It's always nice to see who we're talking to. Again, I realize for some people, it might not be practical, but if it is, please turn on your video and let me see who you are. We have 20 on, and finally, the last order of business, there'll be questions. When you have questions, you can type it into the chat. I think you're all familiar with Zoom, but if you don't know, on the bottom, just click chat and it will come up on the right side of your screen. Or you can click, if you click the participants, you'll see who's on there. And at the bottom of the list of participants, it says raise your hand. And you can raise your hand and we'll call on you. Or you can just unmute and make a lot of grunting noises, and then we'll know you want to say something. Yes, exactly, like that. And because we like when we present, we like it to be as interactive as is practical. So
Yeah, that was actually an official grunt, BT. I just want to add to what
please.
Brahmatirtha Prabhu just said, that BT and I do these kind of joint presentations, not all the time, but we've done a few of them together regularly. So usually what we do is he'll speak for about 10 minutes. I'll speak for about 10 minutes. And the idea is not for you guys to listen to us lecture, but for our brief introductions to promote a discussion. So please feel free to raise your hand or ask questions in the chat, and we'll try not to bore you too long with lectures, and we'll try to open it up to a discussion that benefits everybody.
Yeah, I mean, we want to talk about what interests you, not what I'm thinking about today. Science and spirituality. Well, the first question that comes in, do they go together? There's some who will say that science and spirituality are quite incompatible. We contend quite differently, that from two different angles. One angle is that there is a scientific basis of spiritual life, and also spiritual life, spirituality gives a lot of insights into science. Now, some may find that a little bit surprising, but it does happen. Spiritual life can give amazing insights into what's going on in the world. I'm gonna, when I first met Prabhupada, I was a science teacher in India, and I was of the mindset that science alone will give me intimate knowledge of who I am and the basis of consciousness. And quickly he dissuaded me from that. That science does give great insights, and it's necessary, but not sufficient. And so what else, how does science and spirituality interact in a way that's real, that's not contradictory, and that's helpful? So that's some of what we'll be talking about tonight. With that, I'm going to turn over to Pracarananda and let Pracarananda, why don't you continue?
That was the quickest 10 minutes I've ever heard you speak. I'm going to share my screen with you guys. I want to briefly go through some PowerPoint slides I've made a number of years ago. I don't want to do the whole PowerPoint presentation, but there are a couple slides that I want to take you guys through that sort of illustrates some of the points that Brahmatirtha Prabhu just made. So if you'll just give me a moment, I'm going to share my screen. Boom, there. Did that work? That worked. All right, I'm putting this. All right, never mind the intro slide here. When I used to teach, well, I still do from time to time, teach introduction to geology classes, classes that are commonly known in big universities as rocks for jocks. And so this is typically a large lecture hall class. There might be 200 or 300 people in the class. And the first question that I would always ask the students when they came in on the first day was, how many of you are taking this class because you don't want to take chemistry? And everybody raises their hand. And then I first started doing this at the University of Florida, where interestingly enough, all of the sciences are in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. That's very different from the university I work in right now, where there's just a College of Science and Liberal Arts is in another college altogether in the university. But the point here is that in learning about science, it's also important to learn about the philosophy of science and what is science? What are we talking about when we talk about science? And science is basically a knowledge system that's based on different types of evidence. And so after asking how many of you are taking this class because you don't want to take chemistry, I would take them through this little exercise. We're not going to be able to do the exercise in its full glory because of the Zoom format, but I'll talk you through it. Basically, I would show the students this picture right here, and I would ask them, what do you observe? What is happening in this picture? And of course, we may know that in the scientific method, observation is the first step. what do we see? And people will describe, it looks like it's autumn. There's a black cat crossing a road. The grass needs to be cut. You know, they might make a comment. They might think they know what time of day it is based on the shadows. And we will get a big description. You know, people will describe the scene that they see here. Then I go to the next slide, which is this one. And I asked the class, what happened in this picture? And a very large percentage of the class will say, the cat got run over by the car. And I will ask them, how do you know that? How do you know the cat got run over by the car? Nobody in the class saw the cat got run over the car. And so now they start to talk about different types of evidence besides just direct observation. So the scientific method begins with observation, but then includes other types of knowledge. Some people may say, well, there's a car there and there's a smushed cat. So obviously the car ran over the cat. Nobody saw that happen. Some people who are a little more intelligent, they may go inspect the cat to see if the tread marks on the cat line up with the tread marks on the car. And so we try to piece together evidence that we didn't directly observe, but we piece together the evidence that we have to try to tell a coherent story. Some people in the class may say, well, we can ask the driver, did you just run over the cat? And if we take the driver's word at face value, we'll get an answer. And so I use this example to illustrate the three kinds of knowledge. Talking about the different types of knowledge is the study of what's called epistemology. And in Sanskrit, we have three different types of knowledge. So I have the Sanskrit and the English translations here. Evidence in Sanskrit is called pramana. And there are three types of pramanas. One is pratyaksha. Pratyaksha is what we can directly observe, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Then there's what's called the anuman, which is logic, reason, and arguments. Somebody inspected the tread marks on the cat, and then they inspected the tread marks on the car, and we see that these line up. And that's anuman. That's using logic, reason, argument, inferential thinking, and so on and so forth. And then some people ask the driver of the car, hey, did you just run over the cat? That's called shabda, hearing from an authority. And I just want to go back to the previous slide here for a moment and talk about sense perception itself, because the scientific method is based on sense perception. And more specifically, it's based on quantification of sense perception. And here I have a graph of a mathematical function. This is the mathematical function 1 over x, y equals 1 over x. And the graph of this mathematical function is what's called an asymptote. An asymptote is a curve of a function that approaches a limit, but no matter how far along either the x-axis here or the y-axis you go, you will never actually touch the axis. And that is our sense perception in terms of understanding the universe. We can use our sense perception, we can improve our sense perception through technology, telescopes, microscopes, mass spectrometers, etc. But we will never be able to understand everything about the universe using only sense perception. There are things in the universe that are infinitely small that we will never be able to see, no matter how much technology we develop. And there are things that are infinitely large that we will never be able to see, either because they're too far away or they're too old. And so science is limited in this extent, in that scientific knowledge is always asymptotic. It always approaches a limit, but never achieves the limit. And so there's a gap always between what we're able to perceive directly and what we actually know. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. Between what we're able to perceive directly and what is truth or knowledge. And between that gap, every individual at every moment of their lives is making a choice whether to believe or to be skeptical. Skepticism is the platform of modern science. A scientist is skeptical of everything and is always analyzing and is always asking questions and is always trying to disprove what is being presented to them. Science never proves anything. That's the whole purpose of the asymptote here. Science can only disprove things. So the position of the scientist is one of skepticism. The position of a religious person, on the other hand, is they're taking a leap of faith. They're saying, well, I don't know, I can't see this directly, but I'm going to believe it anyway for whatever reasons we have for basing our faith on. And we see in the Bhagavad Gita, faith is described according to different modes of nature. And like Srila Prabhupada said, faith means unflinching trust in something sublime, which means you can't see it, but you believe it anyway. And so this is knowledge, and this is why there's often a perception of a conflict between science and religion. But I want to skip through now the bulk of this presentation for the sake of time. Take us through a little journey through the Grand Canyon, beautiful Grand Canyon in Arizona. Take a trip. Interesting point, the lower levels of the Grand Canyon are named the Vishnu Schist. They're named after Vishnu, which is interesting. But what I want to present here now is that from a purely spiritual perspective, or from the perspective of Krishna consciousness, knowledge actually doesn't have anything to do with our understanding of facts. Knowledge has to do with our own personal qualifications. And so I just want to, in conclusion here, before turning it back over to BT, or opening it up to the group, I just want to read these few verses from the Bhagavad Gita. This is Bhagavad Gita 13, 8 through 12, where Krishna tells Arjuna the following: humility, pridelessness, nonviolence, tolerance, simplicity, approaching a bona fide spiritual master, cleanliness, steadiness, can't see because I got the thing here, self-control, renunciation of the objects of sense gratification, absence of false ego, the perception of the maladies of birth, death, old age, and disease, detachment, freedom from entanglement with children, wife, home, and the rest, even-mindedness amid pleasant and unpleasant events, constant and unalloyed devotion to the original divine source, that's Krishna, aspiring to live in a solitary place, detachment from the general mass of people, accepting the importance of self-realization, and the philosophical search for the absolute truth. All these I declare to be knowledge, and besides this, whatever there may be is ignorance. So from a spiritual perspective, we are actually presenting a paradigm of knowledge, which is different from this science-religion dichotomy. The religious people argue against the scientists because, as we've seen, there are very strong limitations to scientific knowledge. And the scientists argue against the religious people because oftentimes religious people have blind faith in something that has no justification. And so there's this perception of a conflict. But what we are presenting when we talk about the science of spirituality, or science in spirituality, is a different paradigm of knowledge altogether, which relates to one's own personal qualities and the way one relates to the world around them. And so we're trying to elevate this whole discussion out of this back and forth polarity to a higher platform of understanding what is knowledge really. And in pursuing that type of knowledge, we find that both spirituality and science are essential. And on that note, I will stop my yapping and turn it back over to BT to elaborate or moderate a discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay. At this point, we'll ask, are there any questions or comments? And then we'll take the discussion maybe in an interesting place. But are there any comments or questions on what you've heard so far? Okay, since everyone raised their hand at once, I have to see where to begin. Question comes up is, Pracarananda brought up, what do we really know? And then the other question is, who is it who does the knowing? Now, I'm sitting here talking to you. How is it that I'm seeing you? Well, some light is coming off of pixels on my screen, and it's going through my eyeglasses and entering my eyeball and igniting the optic nerve. And that light is only firing in the brain the equivalent of a few pixels. But our brain is able to, we're able to average it all out and create an image. So who is the we, who is the us, who's creating the image? Who is actually doing the seeing? Now, if it's just the brain doing the seeing, that creates an interesting circumstance, Because if it's just the brain and nothing else but the brain, then consciousness is simply a product of the brain. Now, if consciousness is the product of the brain, it creates a few dilemmas. First, there are some people born with an odd disease in which they only have a brain stem, yet they still become functional human beings. So they don't even have the right parts of the brain. Putting that aside, if we all have great affections in our lives, maybe our parents, our children, our spouse, whoever, we have affections. Why would somebody just have affections just for a brain? There's this wonderful little cartoon. After Einstein died, his brain was preserved in a bottle. It still is. I mean, he did have this particularly powerful brain. And then there's a picture of a vulture sitting on top of the bottle saying to another vulture, "Boy, I'd like to pick his brain." And that's what we can do with brains. We can pick it and we can look at chemicals and neurons. A year and a half ago, the Bhaktivedanta Institute put on a conference. And the conference was called Science, Consciousness in Science. We had 400 people come to opening night. The mayor of the town set it off. And we had two quite renowned scientists, not devotee scientists, but with intention, speaking. And then we went through 2 days of sessions. And we had about 50 devotee scientists come from all over the world. And then people from the university. A friend of mine at the university who's a physician, he's not at all with the Krishna movement, says the best conference he had ever attended. Because what we did is we took the brain and we challenged it. Who are you really? What do you really know? Now, the two keynote speakers, one of them is the most prominent person in the world of science on consciousness and science. He puts on the largest conference in the world on consciousness and science. Every year, it's about this time of year. Due to COVID, it's been postponed now. And he runs the Center for Conscious Research at the University of Arizona. And he's a very nice fellow. I was fortunate to get someone so prominent to come. For example, his next conference, which is going to be online, of course, due to COVID, coming up September. And just this morning, I was looking at who his speakers are. Well, one of them is a meditation session by Deepak Chopra. And he has the famous David Chalmers often comes. He's the one that said physics, the hard problem of physics is what is consciousness. So he rubs elbows with the best of them. And a good fellow, except his premises are missing something. He feels that consciousness is some quantum physical state that occurs in the microtubulars of neurons. I won't go into that in any detail. Yet all it does is going from neurons down one more level. We still haven't talked about who owns the neurons. Now, the other speaker we had was from Princeton University. Now, Brenda Dunn is quite fascinating. Her late partner, Robert John, was no sluffer. Robert John was the dean of engineering at Princeton University, one of the highest positions we can imagine. He was there for 15 years, and no dean at Princeton, I think, has ever served 15 years. He was that good. The rocket engines that are being used right now to send missions to Mars were his design. And he had a sidelight. And his sidelight might interest all of you. His sidelight was, what is really consciousness? And so what he did is he was wondering how machines and consciousness might interact. So he devised this experiment. And in this experiment, he put rows and rows of nails in the wall and a chute and a frame around it, and he dropped 1,000 balls down the chute. Now, can somebody tell me, you drop the balls down the chute like a pinball machine, and you have these parallel rows of nails. What would the pattern the balls make when they go down the chute and spread out through the nails? What do you call that? Can somebody tell me? Anybody knows a little math or science? Anybody? Ah, come on, somebody knows that. It's a famous curve. The curve looks like this. What do you call a curve that looks like this?
Bell curve.
A bell curve. Thank you.
Good book.
Yeah, I know the book too. Controversial book, but quite interesting. So it was a bell curve. And then he would have a couch set up in the room, and he'd invite students in, typically grad students who want to earn $5 or $10. And he'd say, sit in this couch, and all I want you to do is one thing. I'm going to drop these balls down the chute, and I want you to will it so balls will either go left or right, and write down which way you're willing it and seal it in an envelope, and don't let me see it. And then the operator would release a lever, and the balls would drop down the chute, 1,000 balls, and they would spread out in a bell curve. And then they'd count the balls, and they'd open the envelope. And virtually every time, we're talking about repeating this tens of thousands of times, if the student sitting there wanted them to go to the right, you had a few extra balls on the right, statistically significant. Not a lot, enough to be statistically highly significant. Or they'd go to the left. Then they did this with a random number generator. Now this one, they only repeated 800,000 times. And all this is published. And again, this is not some kooks doing some work. This is Princeton University, Dean of Engineering. And they had remarkable results. And they did it with monks, meditating monks they would bring in, and they would even have greater deviations. And then they tried it with a convention of real estate brokers, and they set up in a room and got them to come in, and they had no deviations. It didn't move it at all, which is kind of curious. So, so we have these two speakers at our convention. One is saying that consciousness is something beyond material, and the other saying it's material but very complicated. So I arranged that on purpose at our conference because I wanted to have contrasting views so we could have some great discussions and great insight on it. So I wanted to just offer you some insight into the kind of work we're doing at the Bhaktivedanta Institute. With that, we do have one question posted, and then we'll ask for some more comments and questions. Can you please explain more about the point that was mentioned? Science can only disprove something and not prove something. Pracarananda, that's your bellywick.
Yeah, thank you. I can. So this is part of the scientific method. Like I spoke earlier about the asymptotes of knowledge, that using Anuman, inference, deductive reasoning, and using the power of our own sense perception, even enhanced by technology, telescopes and microscopes, we will never be able to investigate everything in the universe. It's impossible within our short lifespans, even if we accumulate scientific knowledge. And scientific knowledge in the Western sense has been accumulated now for hundreds of years, and still we know really nothing. For example, in my own field, geology, we've constructed a narrative of the geological evolution of the Earth, starting with the formation of our solar system through the Hadean period, the Archean period, the Paleozoic, the Precambrian, the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and so on and so forth. We've constructed this narrative about the history of the Earth, and the narrative itself is largely internally consistent, but it's based off of a vanishingly small amount of evidence. We've developed this narrative based largely off of the rock record and the fossil record. The problem with both of these records are that 99% of the rocks that have ever existed on this planet have been destroyed and recycled. And the vast majority of rocks that have been on this planet are not able to host fossils. So we actually take this very small sliver of evidence and we construct a whole narrative around it. And that narrative is internally consistent. And so by internally consistent, I mean that we can say that it hasn't been disproven, but we cannot say that it's been proven. There's a lot of evidence of plate tectonics, right? We can measure the movement of continents along the what's called the asthenosphere of the Earth. The theory of continental drift was first proposed at the end of the 19th century by a German guy named Alfred Wegener, yes. And he was roundly ridiculed for his theory because he couldn't propose a mechanism by which the continents were moving. It wasn't until after World War II, when the United States government started using submarines to spy on the Russians, that we were able to see evidence of seafloor spreading along the Atlantic Ocean. And so more evidence came to light, and because more evidence came to light, we constructed this theory. But we cannot say the theory has been proven because we are not able to analyze all of the evidence, and we will never be able to analyze all of the evidence. So therefore, a fundamental principle of science is that scientific truths can never be proven. They can only be disproven. And this was a point that was made by a very famous philosopher of science named Karl Popper. And so that's just a fundamental point of the scientific method. Does that answer your question? Who asked the question?
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah,
appreciate
thank you. Yeah, thank you for the question. We have another question for BT. BT, can you share the details of the pair experiments, the papers? You're on mute, BT.
Well, I just shared it, but it was under mute, so too late now. Okay, I will, what I'm going to do is post the web link for the publisher. And I'm pulling that up now. And it's right on top of my mind because publisher and I were corresponding just today for our next project together. Okay, if you go here, the papers and books are all available. The idea is to go beyond a mechanistic view of the world. If everything is just mechanistic, then one thing we lose in it is things like love. They're all gone. They don't mean anything. Now, those of us who are practitioners of Bhakti Yoga, that is the yoga of love. Our goal is to open our hearts and increase our love, ultimately for the Supreme, but certainly for each other. And if everything is just chemicals, then when somebody dies, it's just like a cup of coffee going down the drain. It doesn't have any meaning. So if we're going to have meaning, virtually every philosopher, going back to Aristotle and Plato, understood that the non-materialistic view, metaphysics, is a necessary component to understand the world. There's physics and there's metaphysics, meaning beyond physics. And in order to understand the world, we need to do both. Science provides many useful information. I'll give you an example that might make sense. if I want to measure something that's less than me, that's not conscious, I can do it. I can take a microscope and I can examine fine things. I can take a telescope and I can see far away things. I can take laboratory instruments and analyze the chemicals in things. We can deal with things many different ways. I mean, I have 2 degrees in science. I work as a scientist, so I examine things all the time. But what about if something's greater than me? Would I use the same instrument to examine what's greater than things, the same instrument I use to examine things? Using the wrong instrument in science is always a failure. I'm not going to use a thermometer to measure the color of the sky. I'm going to use a different instrument. So similarly, if I want to know what instruments can we use to measure what's greater than us. So science is going to measure things we can control, things we can put in a laboratory, or things we can control by capturing light from a distant galaxy. Again, we're controlling it. But what about those things beyond our necessary control? What are the instruments to measure that? Now we say, well, there is nothing beyond our control. Fine. But we say there's an experiment one can do. And the experiment is to practice the methods of bhakti yoga. And virtually everyone I know who has practiced the methods of bhakti yoga comes to the conclusion, yes, there's something beyond this body. Now, Justin had mentioned earlier, well, he goes to kirtans. There's an interest. I'm at the University of Florida, and a lot of students come by the Krishna House. We serve out, pre-COVID times, 1,000 plates of vegetarian Krishna lunch 5 days a week, all year round. So one of the most popular programs on campus. The president recently, the university named where we serve out Krishna Lunch Lane. They even put a plaque for Prabhupada on the campus. It's quite a program. So I challenge students who come and say, well, everything is just material. I say, fine, let's do an example. I want you for 1 week to just chant no more than 5 minutes of the Hare Krishna mantra. No more than 5 minutes. Time yourself. Set your iPhone to go. Alarm goes off in 5 minutes. No more than 5 minutes. Chant Hare Krishna. 1 week. But that's only the second week. The first week, I want you to chant Go Gators. That's the name of the football team, the Gators. Go Gators for 5 minutes. I've never met a student who's been able to do Go Gators for 5 minutes for 7 days. And I've never met a student who's been able to do Hare Krishna and restrict it for 5 minutes for 7 days. Now, this doesn't prove anything, but it's highly indicative that there is something special going on here. What's going on? Now, this is a science of Krishna consciousness, because there really is a science that we can test, observe, repeat observations. These are the scientific methods. But we're using tools that are not the ordinary tools of controlling things less than us, since consciousness, we're hypothesizing, is greater than matter. We're using tools that will connect us with consciousness. So let's see. We have another question. I would argue that many of the questions we ask in science and even in daily life seek transcendental answers when there is none. In other words, the answers are in the moment. So much of what we call knowledge cannot be true because the question is unsound in the first place. Now, I may ask the poster to clarify that unless Pracarananda understands what's being asked.
Oh, let's ask Mr. Moto Z or Mrs. Moto Z if they want to chime in with their voice, elaborate. No?
Okay, they don't have
well,
to.
then I will say a couple of things. I think this gets back to the point that I was making, is that we are trying to define a different paradigm of knowledge. You know, even in the points that Brahmatirtha Prabhu was making about the two secular scholars that came to speak about consciousness, they're still fundamentally dealing with consciousness as a material feature of the world. It's ontologically matter, although one of them is dealing with it from a more subtle platform and the other one was dealing with it more from a biochemistry platform. We're saying that, yeah, you're right, we're not asking the right questions. There's a famous, well, I don't know how famous it is, but I read a room conversation with Srila Prabhupada once when he was in India. And Prabhupada used to host darshans in the afternoon in India, and especially when he was in bigger cities. I think this conversation was in Mumbai. He had all of these rich business people in the room, and, you know, Prabhupada's jamming, riffing with these people. They're asking questions. He's answering the questions. And one of these wealthy Indian businessmen asked Srila Prabhupada, Swamiji, what is the goal of life? And I think to maybe us in the West, or to people who are familiar with the language of Krishna consciousness or have been around devotees, that seems like kind of a cliched question. But actually, this is a very intelligent question. What is the goal of life? Because it implies that there is a goal to life. And we know from, for example, the Vedanta Sutras, the very first Vedanta Sutra is Atato Brahma Jigyasa. And the word Atato means therefore in Sanskrit. So it's kind of weird that you would start a book with the word therefore. It implies that something preceded the book that you're reading. And so what is the Atato Brahma Jigyasa? What does the Atato refer to? It means that now that you've attained the human form of life, that's the therefore. Therefore, having attained the human form of life, Brahma Jigyasa, it is important to inquire after what is Brahman. Brahman in Sanskrit refers to that which is beyond the material world, that which is ontologically, fundamentally non-material. And this gets back to your question, and this also, I think, hits directly at the point that Brahmatirtha Prabhu is making, that there's science in Krishna consciousness, and a lot of times when we address the topic of science and Krishna consciousness, we want to talk about cosmology and how the Puranic cosmology is different than the modern cosmology, or is evolution real? And we want to try to reconcile the philosophical teachings of our scriptures with the modern scientific paradigms. But what is actually meant by the science of spirituality is that in this search for what is Brahman, in this Brahma Jigyasa, in this asking, what is transcendence, we are actually presenting a scientific process. Our scientific process starts with a hypothesis. The hypothesis is that we are not these material bodies. This material body is something different than me, and I'm in this body riding around like it's a machine. That's a hypothesis. And in the scientific method, our hypotheses are based on observations, and we can all observe this to a certain extent. I'm right now in a 43-year-old body. I used to be in a 33-year-old body. Before then, I was in a 23-year-old body. The body is changing all the time. I'm still the same person. I've been shaped by the experiences that I've had in this life, but the I that is having these experiences has fundamentally stayed the same. And so my observations in life support the hypothesis. And then what happens in science is that people design an experiment by which they can validate their hypothesis. And we have an experiment also. That experiment is called Bhakti Yoga. And it begins with what's called Shraddha. Shraddha is just it's often translated as faith, but it's more of just like an idea. Like, this is actually a good idea. Maybe these Hare Krishnas are onto something. This is Shraddha. Maybe this is all right. At least they have good food. Let me go eat some food. And then the experiment unfolds. From Shraddha, we think, well, let's go to the temple. Let's go to the Sunday feast. Let's sing in Kirtan. And this is called Sadhu Sangha. This is the second step in the experiment. And a sadhu sangha, of course, is the association of devotees. And in the association of devotees, what do we learn? We learn two things. We learn bhajan and we learn kriya. Bhajan is how to worship Krishna. Kriya is how to work for Krishna. And so we learn these two things in the association of devotees. And by executing the process of bhajana kriya, gradually we experience what's called anartha nivritti. Anartha nivritti is the removal of unwanted things from our heart. And when the unwanted things are removed from our heart, then we can perceive reality as it is. Right now, our consciousness is clouded over by material desires, lust, greed, anger, envy, madness, illusion, so on and so forth. When we are able to remove these things from our heart, we are able to perceive the absolute truth directly. Like Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, pratyakshavargamam dharmyam. This truth is directly perceived. So we are not actually asking people to believe in our religion. We are asking people to execute the scientific experiment of bhakti yoga and come to your own conclusions. And we also see in science, what we know today in science is based off of a long history of people doing experiments. And then when I want to add to the scientific literature, I need to make sure all of the people that came before me in my field are given their due credit. And we see that Prabhupada does this all the time in his writings. For example, in the introduction to the Bhagavad Gita, there are a couple paragraphs in a row where he mentions Devala, Asita, Narada, Gautama, and all of these great sages from mythical time, you know, the great distant past. But then he also mentions modern scholars, Ramanuja, Nimbarka, Vishnu Swami, Madhvacharya, and he mentions them repeatedly. So he's saying that this is an authorized scientific process. And so it's kind of a long-winded way of saying, yeah, I agree completely with your point. We're not asking the right questions. The scientific questions that we ask in the material world today are really geared only towards improving our sense gratification. And this is an explicit feature of the modern scientific method as codified by Francis Bacon, who's considered the father of modern science. And his belief in the scientific method was such that through science, through empiricism, and through experimentation, we will be able to solve all of the world's problems. And what he meant by that is we will be able to increase our material enjoyment, right? We will end sickness, we will end, you know, things like this. But we actually see that in many ways, our modern science has created worse material conditions. Prabhupada often used the example of the atomic bomb, which has brought the world to the brink of destruction so many times and continues to keep the world there. So that's it for my rant this time. Thank you.
Okay. Let me ask Navina, would you like to add something to this discussion on these points? I know you have insights.
Thanks for putting me on the spot. It's always nice to see.
You knew I was
always
going to do
nice
that to you.
see. Always nice to see how the ball is moving around. You know, I'm just appreciating you both are jamming and it's great. No, I mean, a lot of this is above my pay grade, as they say, but I see a lot of truth in it. And different people have different levels of buy-in. So I'm happy to see that we're, you know, finally figuring out how to present our Vedic wisdom in a way that is actually appealing to different classes of people, different mindsets. And whether it be top down or bottom up or inside out, there's different ways of how to approach the subject or the topic. So I'm very appreciative of seeing how this is taking place. And yeah, I just, something stuck out, you know, when I heard that it's about Vada, it's about the truth, you know, not so much about trying to win an argument, because unfortunately, oftentimes that's what happens too often, that people just argue about stuff and at the end they forget what they actually were arguing about, because everyone just wanted to be right. So to look more on a perspective of what is actual truth, and truth may mean different things for different people. Doesn't mean that truth is relative, but there are relative truths, and then there's the absolute truth, and they have relationships between each other. So, and to make people understand that point, that maybe they only see one side of the truth, like kind of like the people with the elephant, you know, they were all right, but they didn't get the full picture of what was going on. And unfortunately, that's oftentimes what we argue about. So yeah, I like your playing good cop and bad cop, or I don't know how you want to divide the roles. You know, the wise elder and the
and the young whippersnap.
Middle-aged
yeah, exactly.
whippersnapper.
Thank you for giving. Yeah. So it's, you know, people want to see that you're blissful. They don't really care how much you know, but they want to see whether your knowledge actually leads to some ananda, you know. Unless there's a little bit of ananda there, a little bit of blissfulness, it's all for naught, you know. It's a total waste of time. So yeah, thanks for being blissful and for pushing forward the mission, even though some of this stuff is as dry as a bone or as a rock. But hey, there are different tastes out there, you know. And hey, we worship rocks and trees, and it's all good. Thank you.
Well,
Hare Krishna.
thanks. I appreciate that a lot. One question came in. Have the scientists ever created a single-celled organism? If not, why is a theory of evolution so popular? Well, that's an interesting question. Why? One reason it's so popular, because it explains, it attempts to explain certain observations we have. Like everything, it's called a theory. None of us have a time machine, so we take little bits of evidence and we hypothesize from it. Now, have the scientists created a single cell? No. And we're contending that actual consciousness is something different than matter, and that matter inhabits consciousness. Now, just like, for example, right now I'm having a kurta, and before I had my bathing suit on, and I live in Florida, of course, and tonight I'll have my pajamas on. So there's a lot of changing going on here. There's also a lot of changing going on, as I used to be a young whippersnap. Now I'm an older whippersnap. The whippersnap might have stayed the same, but what else stayed the same? Why is it that I'm concerned about dying, for example? Everyone's concerned about dying. So why would we be concerned about it if we're just chemicals? It's just intuitive that we're more than that. Now, if we're more than that, just hypothetically, just like we'll accept evolution hypothetically, let's accept hypothetically, just for the moment, that I might be more than matter. How can I know that? If I was, what would I do to examine it? Well, I might put some balls down a chute and see if I can impact that. There's a lot of things we can do. But if we don't at least hypothetically say that, then we'll never understand anymore. So we're saying that's what science is about. If we're talking about science of evolution, we can talk about science of consciousness. Then we can propose hypothesis. Now, somebody asks a question, is the novel coronavirus man-made? Well, I don't know. I was not hiding out in a laboratory in Wuhan to know that, but it's a very interesting question. If it is man-made, can someone make a virus, and is virus life, and what does it mean? These are interesting questions. Pracarananda, you have any insight into that?
Yeah, I want to answer both these questions in one fell swoop. So to Neeraj, who asked about have scientists created even a single-celled organism, the answer to that question is no, they have not. However, and then you tie this into why is the theory of evolution so possible? So in the modern scientific paradigm, it's important to understand that these two things are separate scientific fields. The question of creating a cell is biogenesis or abiogenesis. This is separate as a scientific discipline from evolutionary theory. For our own understanding of where we fit into the world, it's important to know these things. Otherwise, we as a society can come across as being a little bit underinformed. So I'm not saying if that's a good thing or a bad thing or if it's right or it's wrong. I'm just saying that that is the way it is. Viruses are not cells. They and there's an ongoing debate in biology as to whether or not viruses should be considered living forms. The reason is viruses cannot reproduce by themselves. They need a host agent to reproduce. So a virus is basically a little shred of DNA in a package, and that will infect the cell, and it will use that cell that it infects to reproduce itself, and then it will spread virally. So viruses can be man-made, and humans have made viruses in labs. Whether or not the novel coronavirus is man-made, we don't know, and this is beyond the purview of our knowledge. We don't, how would you know? If it was man-made, the people that made it will not tell you. And if you found out about it, I'm sure they'd give you some coronavirus. I do want to come back to the single-celled organism thing, though. There was some experiments made in the 1950s where this was called the Stanley Miller experiment, where some scientists took a vacuum flask and filled it with a prototypical atmosphere of the Earth and zapped it with electrostatic charges to try to reproduce the very earliest conditions of the atmosphere on Earth. And they found that by doing this, they were able to create amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins, which are the building blocks of single-celled organisms. So they were able to get somewhere. Now, there were some problems with the amino acids that they created, which is biochemically, there's something called chirality, which is you can have a compound that has a chemical formula to it, but the chemicals in the formula can be arranged in different ways. And in order for an amino acid to form a protein, the amino acids have to be arranged in a certain way. And in the Miller experiment, they were not. They were all wrong. However, it's been found more recently in the last 10 or 15 years that in environments that Miller was trying to recreate in his experiment back in the 50s, there's often inorganic alteration of rocks going on. I'm talking about in seafloor spreadings. For example, the world's largest mountain chain is at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, which is this huge span of volcanoes. And if you move away from the volcanoes themselves, the rocks, because of the heat and the water involved in these systems, they become chemically altered into different types of clays. And it's been found that there's a particular type of clay called serpentine, which filters out the bad amino acids and increases the number of good amino acids in building life. So there is systems on Earth that filter out things that are not conducive to forming life and increases the concentration of amino acids that are conducive to forming life. And so this is the direction that this research is going in today. But like I said earlier, they will never be able to prove anything. And this is all just taxpayer money being spent to try to investigate these things. So again, I have to reiterate the point that we're, from the perspective of the Bhaktivedanta Institute, we're trying to bring the science spirituality discussion away from these details and into the broader question of consciousness and how consciousness affects our daily life and the daily quality of our lives. And like Navina was saying, there's got to be some ananda. There's got to be some bliss. Otherwise, what are we really doing? So these are very deep topics. I could go on forever. I know we don't have forever.
We have
But
another
I did want to
question.
answer. Yeah, I did want to answer them in some detail.
We have another
Thank you.
question. Moto Z is obviously a deep thinker, but also in a loud place and cannot unmute. So I appreciate that. And the question being asked is this. Are we all the same person? That is a very interesting question. One of the goals of philosophy is to understand the one behind the many. In other words, what's our unity? For example, on this particular call, we have people who are of Indian nationality, Spanish nationality, American nationality. But what's the unity? Well, the unity is we're all interested in higher consciousness. We have some unity there. So the question then comes, is, are we all the same person? Let's look at the politics of it a moment. Our Declaration of Independence declares all men, of course, at that time, they should have said, to be precise, all white men are created equal. But they didn't get into that because at that time, blacks were considered 3/5 of a man for the sake of the census. That is our history. But the idea is all men are created equal. Now, where have you ever met two people who are equal? You haven't. There are no two equal people. Somebody is stronger, somebody's weaker. Even in twins, we find subtler differences, but never complete equality. Somebody is really smart, and somebody is not so smart. I can prove that. They get elected to high offices. And we have all of this variety, yet we accept in America as our fundamental principle something that you can never observe anyplace, impossible to observe, that all people are created equal. So we develop a metaphysical principle. And the founders were, certainly of America, were metaphysicists. If you read their biographies, you'll see that. They were philosophers. And they went with the metaphysical principle that there's some equality going beyond the body that's not even observable. So each of us has something to ask a question with the same person. There's an aspect of us that is the same, and there's an aspect of us that's different. Now, what's different is the external body. But the metaphysicists who founded America said there's something that's the same. Then the question comes in, are we all the same person? Well, we can observe that everybody has different tastes, different desires, different propensities. So by observation, there's something that's the same, and there's something that's very different. Then we can go to sources like the Bhagavad Gita, which discusses this, because Arjuna, Gita is a 30-minute conversation. He had a similar question. Are we the same or not the same? And the answer is given, yes, we are the same and not the same. We have the same essence in each of us, but we're all particular individuals. At least that's the conclusion of the Gita, and that's the conclusion I find by observation. Now, next question. I know of some people who have actually felt sad chanting Maha Mantra for weeks instead of happy. How can this be explained? That's actually discussed in some advanced literatures by Rupa Goswami. That topic is discussed. When we engage in any process of self-realization, we're peeling away layers. And as we're peeling away layers of illusion and getting to our real self, sometimes that road can have ups and downs. And when we have our downs, that doesn't mean it's not working. It means we're feeling some melancholy as we lose some of our ahankara is a Sanskrit word, our false ego, our false identification of who we really are. And we've all experienced that as we kind of wake up to a higher reality. Sometimes we might cling to a lower reality. For example, when I was a child, I would walk by toy stores and I would just salivate over the toys I wanted. I mean, if I walked by a toy store, I just had to go in there. You know, I'd yank at my parents to go in there because I wanted something. Now, if I walk by a toy store now, I have no interest at all. I have no interest in it. Now, there was a period of time when I was growing up, maybe when I lamented that I no longer wanted toys. So I wasn't quite, there's that in-between period. So similarly, when we chant Hare Krishna, we may get an in-between period as we're growing up and giving our childish ways, getting to a more mature way. Maybe somebody else on the call has a different explanation for this. Anybody want to add anything to that? That's a very nice question, by the way. I really like that question a lot. With that said, I've been told that class is supposed to go until 7:45 Central Time, and right now it's 7:46 Central Time. So with that, if there's any final question or comment, let me know. Otherwise, I think we'll wrap up. I'm glad if any of you would like to correspond. I'll put on here the website for the Bhaktivedanta Institute, and you can correspond with us through that website.
Yeah, if anyone has any follow-up questions, yes, so Brahmatirtha Das just put his information in the chat box. If anyone has any other burning comments, questions, or reflections, you can feel free. 7:45, but we can go a little bit if anyone has any burning questions. If not, I had an appreciation for what was said earlier about how this was from a quote from Bhagavad Gita that Pracarananda Prabhu had brought up, which was that knowledge isn't necessarily defined or dependent on facts, but as it's put in a different way, that knowledge is defined as internal qualities. So my question originally was going to be, how do you guys as scientists relate those qualities that Krishna describes in Bhagavad Gita as knowledge, like pridelessness, humility, freedom from attachment, and devotion? How do you bridge that gap or how do you apply that as science? Or I've always said that we're like walking laboratories of consciousness. So, you know, as we kind of purify ourselves and we start to see things that we might not be able to see with our senses, but if you had any comments on how you guys as scientists or anyone that's pursuing a scientific path can apply those qualities that were recommended.
We'll both take a stab at it, I think. One of the realizations is that how much we know is dependent on the level of our consciousness. The Gita gives 3 levels: ignorance, passion, and goodness. And as our consciousness gets closer to goodness, we know more. We see more. I see it myself. Now, I'm not saying I'm always in goodness, but there are moments when my consciousness is higher, and there are moments when it's lower. I think everyone on this call will experience that. And when my consciousness is elevated through the good practices, I have a lot greater insight. I certainly can understand the difference between body and soul in ways that I couldn't otherwise. I can see things I can't. So as we elevate our consciousness, we see more. And one of the things the instructions Prabhupada gave to the Bhaktivedanta Institute when he founded in the mid-70s was raise our consciousness. He insisted on that we do the same as everyone else must do. Because if we don't, we're not going to get great insights and we're not going to see things very, very deeply. And you'll find many of the great thinkers of the world have engaged in personal austerities to raise their consciousness. You look at Socrates or Plato or others, you go on and on. Gandhi was a modern example of somebody who worked hard to raise his consciousness and basically defeated the British. So there is a raising consciousness is a key component of each of our personal lives in the Bhaktivedanta Institute. We cannot succeed without doing that. Pracarananda, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think I can add a couple personal anecdotes from my own life history. I didn't become a scientist professionally because I was seeking the absolute truth through science. I became a geologist because I'm really interested in rocks and water. And so in that regard, Druta Karma Prabhu, who's a Prabhupada disciple, he was involved in Forbidden Archaeology and many other books, recently wrote a book called My God, My Science, which I would recommend to all of you. He also gave a presentation at the ISKCON Leadership Sangha meeting in Mayapur this year, where he talked about how devotees as individuals can develop their own relationship with science as a devotee. And there's no right answer for this. It's all very individual. Speaking from my own life, I just try to embody those qualities in my day-to-day professional life. I try honesty, integrity, all of these things. And I don't advertise that I'm a devotee, but people know that I'm a devotee. And just a real quick story, the job that I have now, I got when I was finishing my PhD in Germany. I was planning on getting out of academics. For me, getting a PhD was a goal unto itself. There was nothing beyond that. I wanted to retire and move to Vrindavan when I finished my PhD. But one day, a lady called me into her office, a senior colleague that I was working with, called me into her office because she said she wanted to discuss postgraduate research opportunities with me. And I thought, all right, I'll go hear this woman out. And I went into her office and she started asking me all these questions about Hare Krishnas. And I was like, I did not look like this. I had a beard, it was, how did she know I was a Hare Krishna? And so I asked her, how did you know I was a Hare Krishna? I don't advertise this. And she told me that she had noticed that in our weekly department seminars, she noticed that I communicated with people differently than the way everybody else in the group was communicating with people. And so she went to the HR department at the research institute I was working at and pulled up my resume to see if I had any training in communication. And what she found was that I was an ISKCON brahmachari for 10 years. And she was really interested in that. And she offered me a job because of that. And I told her she was crazy. She got this job in Alberta as the head of this research section, and she wanted to bring me on as a postdoc. And I told her she was crazy. And she said, why do you think I'm crazy? And I told her, if you were to advertise this job openly, you would find somebody a lot more qualified and a lot more experienced than me. And she said, I don't want someone a lot more qualified and a lot more experienced than you. I want you. And it was because of this devotional training. I don't ascribe this to myself. It's because Krishna is all attractive. And when devotees are properly situated in their devotional lives, as a grihasta, as a brahmachari, vanaprastha, whatever, when devotees are properly situated in their spiritual lives, we reflect Krishna back to the world, and we also become all attractive. And so it doesn't matter. We all need to earn an honest living, and earning an honest living means that we work according to our own guna and karma. We work according to the nature and the propensities that we've acquired, but we work as devotees. Prabhupada wrote in a purport in the Bhagavad Gita that there's no difference between the activities of a materialistic person and a devotee. The only difference is the consciousness of the devotee. And so we need to bring these qualities into the world. This is what the world is starving for. Nobody cares about flying mountains and, you know, is the moon further away from the earth than the sun, or is there macro or micro evolution? People really don't care about this stuff. People want to know, who are you as a person? Are you trustworthy? You know, are you arrogant? Are you clean? This is what attracts people to Krishna. And Krishna is the all-attractive person. And when we present Krishna as he is, everybody becomes attractive. And so I'm personally inspired to try to bring Krishna into the world by trying to manifest my own microscopic versions of Krishna's qualities in all of my interactions with people. And I see that people become interested in Krishna automatically. People want to know, you know, why is that guy different from other people? What is it about him or her that sets them apart? And that opens the door to tell people about Krishna. And I find that in my professional life, I'm actually able to preach quite openly to people because I've established trust. You know, they know I'm not there to convert them to a religion. They're becoming interested in me as a person because of my personal relationships with them. And we forget this in Krishna consciousness. Bhakti yoga is about relationships. And it's not only our relationship with Krishna, it's our relationship with every jiva, not just the human jivas. That may be a little tangential, but I want to address this last question here. Freedom from entanglement, children, wife, home, and the rest. This is from the entanglement with them, not from them itself. So husbands and wives, I mean, actually, Bhaktivedanta Thakur said in Kali Yuga, the safest place for a Vaishnava is as a grihasta. But it's important to know that the trappings of our griha, our wife, our husband, our kids, our cars, our artwork, you know, our furniture, this is not ours. That's the entanglement. The entanglement is thinking that this stuff belongs to me. This stuff does not belong to me. It belongs to Krishna, and it should all be used in Krishna's service. And in this way, it doesn't matter where someone is situated in their life. Everything can be used in Krishna's service.
Okay, we have two more questions, and we'll finish. One is many.
I answered the second one.
No, there's still two more.
I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Many religions talk about miraculous events like great floods, walking on water. How could these be possible? Well, that's a nice question. How can they be possible? What do you say, Pracarananda? You want to take a try at that one? I have some thoughts, but what do you say?
Yeah, Prabhupada said impossible is a word in a fool's dictionary. Just because science can't explain it doesn't mean it's not real. You know, there's so many things beyond the purview of science that we don't know. So great floods we see are real. I mean, there have been times in the Earth's history quite clearly where the entire planet was covered with water. There's also been times in the Earth's history where the entire planet was covered with ice, frozen water. So that's not a miracle. Walking on water, these are described as yogic cities. There's a yogic city called Lagima City where a yogi is able to make himself lighter than air. And so these are not miracles, actually. These are just the results of yogic austerities. We describe them as miracles in the modern world because people don't know anything about yogic perfections.
We observe there are sciences that are lost. For example, there is no explanation for certain ancient, even the pyramids, the cement in the pyramids. Nobody's been able to duplicate how that happened. There are giant structures on top of mountains in the Andes. No one knows how it got there. If I would take my cell phone and I would go and take it, sometimes there's still primitive tribes in the jungle that anthropologists come across who have never seen modern society. So I walk there with my cell phone and I show them pictures, and all to them it's a miracle. When my son was growing up, we didn't have a television. We thought there were better things for him to do. So when he was about 4 years old, the boss where I worked invited my family over to his house, and my son went there, and he saw a TV, and he was trying to touch the people in it. And he said, "What is this?" He had no idea. To him, it was a miracle. The boss first said to me, Randy says, "What's going on?" I said, "Oh, he's never seen a television." And first he was shocked, and then he was awed. He said, "That's wonderful. My kids are glued to it all day." So he thought it was wonderful. But to my son at that time, that was quite miraculous. To me, I can understand it, but I really don't understand it. I don't think anyone on here can sit down and explain to me in detail how a television works, how all the transistors and it all fits together, and how it all works. Maybe there's an electrical engineer who can give something, but at some point he's going to say, "I just don't get that. That part I don't know." So there's a lot of things we don't know. So just because in 2020 we know certain things and certain things we don't know, we call the things we don't know miracles. But there are, in Radhanath Swami's book, he describes seeing these yogis in the mountains, and I believe him. He saw them doing things that we can't do. But when I asked Prabhupada about this, he says, "Well, it's just ignorance. We just don't understand it." All these things have a process, and it's not, and some of the processes we don't know, and we shouldn't be so proud that we understand every process there is. Let me see. When Krishna is all supreme conscious being, what is the need to create other living entities when he's self-sufficient and self-satisfied? Well, that is an advanced theological question. That may take more time to get into than we would have today. But we're all eternal. And so Krishna is eternal, according to the Bhagavad Gita at least. Krishna says we all existed eternally, so we're here. And Krishna likes company. So if Krishna likes company, I like company. Why shouldn't Krishna like company? He's a person. I don't want to be alone all the time. I mean, sometimes I like being alone, but if I was alone all the time, I'd get a little disturbed by that. I think almost any of us would. So if God's a person, and he's entitled to company. Okay, with that, I think we've reached 9 o'clock, the witching hour. You've been a really nice audience. You've asked many, many good questions. All the questions were good. I wish we had more time for more questions, maybe another day. But thank you very much for having us here, and have a good evening. And as we always say, Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Thank you so much, Brahmatirtha,
Hare Krishna.
Pracarananda Prabhu, for speaking with us tonight. We really appreciate it. And everyone, this is great. Everyone did ask some really good questions. It was a wide range of questions that was really, really interesting. And then if anyone has any other burning questions for them as well, again, their emails are in the chat. So if you want to write it down, you can screenshot it if you like. Also, this dialogue was also recorded, and it'll be on our YouTube channel as well, Truth Matters. And then before everyone goes, if anyone is interested in further discussions like this on a monthly basis, or we also have reading groups as well in regards to books that deal with these matters of consciousness and spirituality. So if anyone's interested in those as well, then feel free to email us at truth.matters.chicago@gmail.com. But with that being said, if there's nothing else, then maybe if everyone wants to go off of video for a second, and we can all kind of wave goodbye to our speakers.
And you're a great host, Damodar. You really are.
Yeah, thank you. This was fantastic.
You kept smiling and keeping us focused. You're very good at this. You're quite good. Yeah. Quite good. Keep this up.
Yeah. Thank you so much, guys.
Okay.
All right,
And
everyone.
thank
Hope
you
have a
for
good
inviting
night.
me, Yamuna. I appreciate it.
Hare Krishna.
Good night. Hare
Hare
Krishna,
Good
everyone.
night. Hare Krishna.